Hello, my name is Deanna Beacham. I'm the American Indian Program Manager for the National Park Service Chesapeake Bay. And this video is being brought to you courtesy of Richmond National Battlefield Park and the Maggie Walker National Historic Site. And I appreciate very much their help in making this possible. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the beginning of the concept of the Indigenous cultural landscape and how it became part of the National Park Service. It started when I was working as a partner for the National Park Service, especially on the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail. And as a result of that, we ended up doing a response to the President's executive order about the Chesapeake Bay, which involved restoration and protection. And specifically, we were talking about land conservation. There was a small team of people that were writing the response to the executive order, and we were talking about the kinds of lands that we wanted to protect around the Chesapeake Bay. I was asked to be there to be an Indigenous voice, and as quite often happens, I was the only Indian in the room. So we start to talk about large landscapes and how that fit with the perspective of Indigenous peoples. Everyone said, but how does that work? Because when we think of Indian sites, we think of the towns that John Smith mapped and he put on his map, or the places where some interaction happened that is what happened with the Europeans, or an archaeological site, or a sacred spot, or some place that's sacred to the Indians. And we don't know how that works with a large landscape. And I tried to explain that our concept of an Indigenous landscape was so much broader than that. And to get people to understand, I would talk about what happened back before the Europeans came. I said, look, here in the Chesapeake Bay, we were living in small communities along the rivers and creeks primarily, and we were doing things that happened not just where our houses were, but at places all throughout the landscape. Men had different tasks from women, and they all went different places. And the people that lived in the town would split up, organize to go different places at different times. There would be farming, and some women were doing that. The women were going to the marshes so that they could gather reeds, and in the winter to get tuckahoe, which was used as a starch. The women were also doing a lot of things that had to do with taking care of furs, making clothing, gathering medicines, going one place to get certain kinds of nuts, another place to get certain kinds of plants you couldn't get anyplace else. Maybe going out in the water to help with the fishing. So the men at the same time were going hunting in different places. Sometimes it would be for birds in the marsh, or maybe uplands to get the deer and the small mammals. The children were also hunting small mammals. They were going everywhere. Men would sometimes go for many miles to find the kinds of stone that you needed to make the tools. So you weren't just living in these little houses just like today. You're going all over the place to the different parts that made your land. You had to remember how to get all of these places. Most of them you'd go in canoes, sometimes on foot. You had to know where to go for miles in different directions and not get lost. And that was part of your world. That was your Indigenous landscape. And people started to understand from that perspective what it meant. And I told this story a number of times, and I was usually waving my arms around, trying to explain exactly what it was. And people would say, you know what, you've got to write this down. I'm like, I'm a storyteller. I don't write things down. But no, you got to write it down. So I did. And what happened was, not only was it used toward protecting lands in the executive order, but it got picked up and used as a priority conservation kinds of landform for the comprehensive management plan of the Captain John Smith Trail. Well, when I started to think about that, I realized you've got to have more information in there about how using this will involve Indigenous communities, about how it brings in their values of how they relate to the land and to the water and to the environment around them, and respect for all of the beings, whether they're inanimate or animate, and how people related to the world, and that you also would get Indigenous communities, descendant communities involved and give a chance for them to talk about these things and to also teach from history and enhance heritage tourism by doing this. I mean, there were so many things that this idea was rich in. So it ends up as an appendix to the John Smith Trail book. And, you know, when you become part of the Park Service, that means you have to become part of the bureaucracy in a way. So we had to form a committee to talk about what the criteria were and how other people could know what this was. And that committee had people from the states, and it had National Park Service and Fish and Wildlife personnel, and it had academics, and it had American Indians from the tribes. And they're all talking about it, and some people are thinking different things. But ultimately, we expanded the paper, and people got interested in it, and then they said, well, you have to start talking about it. So this video is a culmination of talking about this in many ways. And what I'm hoping is that people that will hear it will be talking more about it, explaining what the Park Service is doing, explaining other ways that people are using it for heritage tourism, for interpretation, for land conservation, which is what instigated the idea in the beginning. And that way we can all gain something from adding an Indigenous perspective, all the other kinds of landscapes that we hope to conserve. Thank you.